a lot. I know the CIA works in mysterious ways, but even that one baffled me. Thanks very much for coming tonight, and thanks for coming out in this heat. I was told it was going to be hot up here, and I said, well, I just drove up from Sacramento, where it's like 108, and I don't have air conditioning in my car. And I want to talk about hot. Nothing's going to be as hot as that. First of all, I want to recognize a couple of people that are here tonight. First, Peter Dale Scott, right there in the back, the author of Cocaine Politics. And if you haven't read his book, as a reporter, I love finding guys like him because it means I don't have to go out and reinvent the wheel. I can just read all the fabulous research he's done, and Cocaine Politics is literally the first book I started off reading when I started on the story. And I'd also like to recognize Coral Baca, who was the person who called me up in Sacramento about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, and told me this rather crazy story about this Nicaraguan Contra drug ring, cocaine that was being sold to help buy weapons, and people bringing in tons of cocaine under CIA auspices, and it all sounded rather strange. But I did not have the benefit of having read Peter Dale Scott's book and other books like it. So I thought the idea of the CIA smuggling drugs was some sort of crazy conspiracy theory. And now I know that what we've been told since the 1980s was true. That the CIA knew about Contra drug smuggling. That various agencies of the U.S. government were in on it, protected them, helped them do it, looked the other way while they were doing it, and sort of screwed up a lot of inner city neighborhoods in our country, specifically down in south central Los Angeles. And that's really, it was one phone call. It was when Coral called me, because I was a legislative reporter. I was covering the California legislature. I was writing stories about the budget, which I know I love to write, and I'm sure everybody loved to read stories about the California budget. And covering initiative campaigns, and I was doing occasional investigations of state government. I'd done a series on California's asset forfeiture program, which is this great program where the cops could come in and take everything you owned if they thought you were a drug dealer, and really didn't have to prove anything, which is great if you're a cop. You can just come in and take everything somebody owns, and it was up to them. It was up to you, if that happened to you, to go to court and explain why the couch you bought wasn't bought with drug money. Try to do that, by the way. Try to prove where you got the money to buy anything. And so I thought this was sort of an unfair situation. I wrote a series on it, and the California legislature abolished the law. And so now you actually have to be charged with a crime and convicted of a crime to lose property under the forfeiture laws, which seems only fair. But that's what I was into. That's what I was doing. And so when I got somebody on the other end of the phone telling me about the CIA and drugs, I was not all that thrilled to hear it, first of all. I think I tried to get her off the phone a couple of times, and thank God she was persistent. But now, 3 years later, here we are, and I did the series for the Mercury. They held a couple of very specious hearings in Washington on this issue, mostly to put the denials of Contra officials on the record that they didn't know anything about drug trafficking. And that all started with one phone call. And when you think about it, that's really, a lot of times, that's the way life works. Think about how you met your husband or your wife, or how you got your job, or how you wound up in the profession you're in. And a lot of times it was just somebody made one phone call, or you ran into somebody, met somebody. And really, that's sort of the theme that I tried to bring to this book, was that a lot of things in life happen not because of any plan, but because they just happen. And I want to say, and I'm sure a lot of people will be surprised to hear me say this, maybe not, but I do not believe that crack was a CIA conspiracy, or anybody's conspiracy. And I've never believed that black Americans or South Central was targeted by the United States government to become the crack capital of America. But that is not to say that I think the CIA's hands or the government's hands are clean. And after 3 years of looking into this, I'm convinced more than ever that the responsibilities, the government responsibilities for the drug problems in inner cities in our country is far greater than I ever suggested in the newspaper. But I think it's important to make a difference and recognize the difference between malign intent and gross negligence. And it sounds like quibbling, but it's an important distinction. I mean, it's the thing that separates manslaughter from premeditated murder. But in this case, it doesn't change the fact, and in any case, it doesn't change the fact you've got a body on the floor. And when I hear people getting all involved about, well, was this the CIA's conspiracy, was it intent, was that, it sort of misses the point that you've got a huge drug problem that the government had a role in, and that's the issue that's not being discussed. Now, there were a number of years ago, there was a great show on PBS called Connections, which featured a British historian named James Burke. And this show was fascinating. He would take an event, and the one I remember particularly was the event of the scarcity of firewood in 13th century Europe. And he would trace the repercussions of that event down through modern history and point out that it was this event that caused people to create the steam engine. And his thesis was that everything sort of hooks up if you look at things a certain way. And in the first chapter of the book on which his series is based, he wrote that history is not, as we are so often led to believe, a matter of great men and lonely geniuses pointing the way to the future from ivory towers. At some point, every member of society is involved in the process by which innovation and change come about. The key to why things change is the key to everything. And what I tried to do in Dark Alliance, and what I tried to do in the newspaper series, I think I did better in the book, is to demonstrate how the collapse of a brutal pro-American dictatorship in Latin America, combined with a decision by CIA agents to raise money for a resistance movement by any means necessary, how those events led to the formation of the nation's first major crack market in South Central Los Angeles, and the arming and empowerment of LA street gangs, and the spread of crack to black neighborhoods across the country, and the passage of very racially discriminatory sentencing laws that are today locking up thousands of young black men in jail for most of their adult lives. But my point is, it wasn't a conspiracy so much as it was a chain reaction. And this chain reaction, it started down in like I said, down in Nicaragua. And the first link in this chain, and so you can understand this, I'll just explain it briefly. Because a lot of people say, oh, this is crazy, this is nuts. New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, they say this just didn't happen. In 1979, and the book pretty much starts in 1 month, in 1 year, starts in July 1979, when a band of revolutionary guerrillas called the Sandinistas overthrew the government of Nicaragua, which had been run for about 40 years by the Somoza family, pretty much as the wholly owned subsidiary of the CIA in the United States. I mean, they did whatever we wanted them to do. A lot of people don't realize that when they started the Bay of Pigs invasion, part of it left from Nicaragua, and part of the troops that were sent into Cuba were trained in Nicaragua. That's how close the governments were. And in '79, when this government fell, you had a bunch of essentially war criminals. You had a bunch of very wealthy businessmen, all the folks that were close to Somoza, suddenly found they couldn't live in their own country anymore because the Sandinistas were tired of them. They didn't want them there anymore. And a lot of them naturally came to the United States. And among this flood of predominantly right-wing politicians and exiles and businessmen were the two men who were sort of two of the three main characters in my book, a fellow named Norman Meneses and a fellow named Danilo Blandon. And soon after these two men got here, they became involved, naturally enough, in counter-revolutionary activities. They were interested in kicking the Sandinistas out of Nicaragua and taking back over the country on behalf of themselves and Somoza's family in Somoza. And they started off, and they had a head start on most normal exile groups because they had access to a lot of money. Norman Meneses at that time was one of the biggest drug traffickers in Central America. The CIA would call him the kingpin of narcotics trafficking during Somoza's time. And he goes all the way back in the cocaine era to the early 70s with the Peruvians and the Bolivians, back when the Colombian cartels didn't even exist. I mean, he predates a lot of people. And so they used this cocaine pipeline he had to finance the Contra-War movement here in the United States primarily. They used drug money that was coming out of San Francisco, coming out of Oakland, coming out of Berkeley, most part, I mean, in those times, Meneses' operation was centered here. And they opened up offices here in the city. The FDN offices were opened up with drug money. People, they would pay airline tickets, they would pay rent, they would, office supplies, all of it courtesy of the cocaine they were selling up here. And this was pretty well known to the police. I went back through the arrest records, and there was a Meneses here being arrested with cocaine, and another Meneses. It was a family-run operation primarily. It was him and his million nephews. And all the nephews were getting busted regularly with cocaine. So the cops knew, the DEA knew very early on. Actually, the first female agent in San Francisco was assigned to the Meneses case back in the late 70s. So it was fairly well known what these men were doing. And when they got the idea that they were going to do this for the Contras, they branched out, and they opened a branch office of this operation down in Los Angeles. And this fellow, Danilo Blandon, was put in charge of the LA distribution hub of this drug ring. And he has an interesting background. He has an MBA in marketing. So he was going in, he was pretty good. He had worked for the Nicaraguan government. His job was to open up wholesale markets for agricultural products. He did this as, essentially, he was working for the United States as well, because we were financing his program. We sent him to the University of Bogota to get his MBA. And he came here to the United States and put it to use by opening up a wholesale market for cocaine down in Los Angeles. And at this point in time, that was, as I said in the book, getting in the cocaine business in 81, 82 was like getting in on the ground floor of Amway. The market was really starting to explode. You had the cartels in Colombia were starting to gear up. They were bringing in a lot of cocaine at a lot cheaper prices than they'd ever seen before. So the drug was able to drift down from the penthouses where it had been confined down to normal people in the streets. It was getting within the range of average citizens. Well, I don't know about that. $2,500 an ounce is still pretty high. But one of the places they started selling this drug when they went down to open up this LA market was South Central Los Angeles. And it was primarily through a series of connections they had through vocational education schools and auto dealers that they started. Blandon got a job with a couple of these gigantic, they're known as the trees. They were two Nicaraguans who were major cocaine traffickers, the Torres brothers. They were like 6'7", 6'8". And the dealers called them the Twin Towers, and the cops called them the trees. They gave him a job at a used car lot he had, and he started, this was his cover, and he would start selling cocaine. And this was a good place to work because the trees were married to two cousins of a fellow named Pablo Escobar, who was the head of the Medellin cartel. So he had a pretty good connection right off the bat. And he started selling cocaine around Los Angeles. And in '82, he met this kid named Ricky Donnell Ross. And Ricky was a 19 or 20-year-old, I believe, at the time. He was trying to, he had pretty well given up. He wanted to be a tennis player. And he was trying to get a college scholarship. And got a tryout with the Long Beach State tennis team. And when they found out he was illiterate, they said, well, we're not interested in you anymore. Because he apparently wasn't that good that they could overlook a thing like illiteracy and give him a scholarship. So he was sort of out on the streets trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life, and he started dealing little bits of cocaine. He started stripping cars. He started, stealing wheels, and was dealing with cocaine. And he got this cocaine from his vocational school teacher, the guy that was teaching him auto upholstery. And they were talking about it one day, and Rick said, this seems like a lot easier than stripping cars. Maybe how do I get into the cocaine business? And the guy told him, bring me $300 and you're in. And so Rick and his buddy Ollie went out and stole some wheels. I thought this was a nice touch. They went back to their junior high school, and they stole a faculty member's car and hawked the wheels. And came back with some money and got started in the cocaine business that way. And eventually Rick, he was a very dedicated guy. He was the kind of guy who would practice for hours and hours and hours on the tennis court. he started devoting the same intensity to cocaine trafficking. And he was sort of one of the first down in South Central to really get onto cocaine, because he said most of his friends, most of the people he knew were dealing PCP, or Sherm, or water, or whatever you want to call it. And they said they used to make fun of him because he was like one of the few guys out there selling cocaine, and they were moving all his PCP. And he said what they didn't realize, he said every time somebody came to me, they were giving me $100. He said they go to my friends over there selling water, and he said they walk away like 10 or 15. So he said I didn't need that many people. And he said that's why I like dealing cocaine, because it was a higher profit item. And eventually he outgrew his teacher. His teacher started getting nervous and saying, look, I'm a school teacher, I'm not a drug dealer, and you guys are starting a business, so why don't I introduce you to my source? And his source turned out to be one of these Nicaraguans who was working for Danilo Blandón. And eventually Rick outgrew him, and he outgrew the next guy, and finally he got to the top of the tree, and there was Danilo Blandón, and they hit it off. I mean, they really hit it off. They liked each other, they respected each other, they were good friends, and together they blanketed Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, with cocaine. And the thing is, right at the time they started doing this, it was a change in the cocaine market. And this is something I talk about in the book. It was coming on a parallel track in history. When you had the Contra War here, you had the cocaine smoking habit here coming up from South America, and they both collided in South Central Los Angeles in 1982 and 1983, when suddenly people who Rick was selling his powdered cocaine to were taking it home and putting it on the stove and cooking it up and throwing some baking soda and water together and making this new thing called crack. And Rick said that, nobody believed it was dope when they first started seeing it. It didn't look like cocaine. You couldn't smoke cocaine. People were saying it was cocaine. Nobody believed it. It was only $25, and everybody knew you couldn't buy cocaine for $25. But people started trying it, and gradually, he said, they began asking for it. And Rick was very quick to spot a trend, and so he said, I went out and I hired somebody to make it for me. Because I didn't know how to make it. I got an F in chemistry. And so he started making it, and by 1983, 84, both he and Blandón said they were moving upwards of 150 kilos a week. And if you stop and think, a kilo of cocaine, according to the DEA, makes about 25,000 doses of crack. That's 1 kilo. And these guys were doing 150 a week. So you can sort of do the math and see how much they were moving. And Rick said that some days they were doing like $2 and $3 million a day in crack. Because the problem is the crack's so addictive. Once you start on it, you've got a customer for life. And as I go through part of the book is the history of crack and what happens and how it got here. And it was, I think, pretty much a historical coincidence that it got to South Central at the same time the Contras did, with all their masses of cocaine, and fueled this market. It was an instant success, as it had been in Lima, Peru when it started in '74, as it had been in Bolivia. I mean, you could track it all the way up. Everywhere it hit, it was an overnight success. Now, like I said, a lot of people disagree with that scenario. The government and the media will have you believe that crack started overnight in 1986, sort of like a lotto game. Almost one day it was there, and one day it wasn't there, next day it was there. And it was coast to coast, and it was in every city in the United States overnight, and it was a giant problem, and we have to throw everybody in jail who deals with it to crack down on this. The problem is that's not the way it happened. It started very small scale in Miami, started in South Central. And it spread from there, and it came from the West Coast and the East Coast roughly the same time, and met in the middle of the country about 1989. But the argument is, well, this would have happened anyway. And it very well may have. I mean, crack was on its way, there's no doubt about it. But to argue that it would have happened exactly that same way, that it would have started in South Central Los Angeles, that it would have started in black neighborhoods, I don't think you can argue that without taking into account the fact that the Nicaraguan Contras are bringing a lot of cocaine into South Central and giving it to a guy who the LA Times would later write was the man most responsible for spreading crack through Los Angeles. I mean, they did a big story on Freeway Rick back in '94 and described him as the Dr. Moriarty of the crack epidemic. And when I pointed out that, yeah, that's true, but he was getting his cocaine from these Contras, suddenly we had to go back and change history. Now, the one question people have a hard time answering, that believe that this theory of mine is crazy, I say, well, okay, then you explain why crack started in black neighborhoods first. Why did crack distribution networks leapfrog from one black neighborhood to another and bypass white neighborhoods and bypass Hispanic neighborhoods and bypass Asian neighborhoods? And what you will hear is this. Well, everybody knows that people down in South Central are poor. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of poor neighborhoods, and they aren't all black. And then we're told, well, there's a lot of high teenage unemployment down there. And that's true too. But it's also true in Appalachia. I mean, I worked in Kentucky for a number of years, and I would see teenage unemployment rates at Colgood and Hazard would be 30 and 40%. So that doesn't wash either. And then we say, well, it's because they don't have very strong families. As if there are no white people trying to raise kids on food stamps and AFDC and everything else. And then we're told, well, it's because crack's so cheap. That's why it's so popular. I mean, $20 is $20, no matter where you spend it. So once you eliminate these theories, and I think you can eliminate them pretty easily, there are two other theories that are left, both of which are far less comforting to think about. And one is that there's just something about people in black neighborhoods that causes them to be genetically predisposed to drug dealing, which is a racist argument that nobody's really advocating publicly. Although I can tell you that I think you saw some of that in some of the reaction pieces that were in the New York Times and Washington Post, where they argued that, well, the reason black Americans are so upset about this story is because they're just more susceptible to conspiracy theories than other people. I mean, honest to God, those were the stories. I mean, Peter Scott can vouch for that. He read them. I thought I'd woken up and it was 1950s again, reading stuff like this in the New York Times, but no, it was today. These analyses never pointed out that a lot of white Americans think Elvis is alive. So I suppose that makes us susceptible to conspiracy theories as well. The other reason is that, and I think this is the reason that comes closest to the truth, is that someone started bringing cheap cocaine into black neighborhoods before they brought it into other neighborhoods. And in that time period, it allowed black cocaine dealers, primarily gang-connected black cocaine dealers, to get a head start on everybody else. I mean, because the cocaine business operates pretty much like any other business. I mean, it takes time to get a business going. And the advantage South Central had is that it had a pre-existing gang infrastructure. It had gangs that were selling PCP and marijuana, so it doesn't take any time at all to start funneling cocaine into that system and spread it around. And once these networks were entrenched and established, they spread crack along cultural and ethnic lines, embodied by the street gangs. And by the late 80s, you were seeing all these reports on TV about how we've got Crips in Seattle, and how we've got Crips in Kansas City, and how we've got Crips in New Orleans. And the reason for that is simple. The LA crack market got saturated. There were too many people selling crack. And so people started going out, it's called it taking it on the road. And they would go out and they would start moving into other cities. And so by 1989, it was everywhere. So it seems to me that if you're looking for the root of a drug problem in a neighborhood, nothing else really matters except the drugs and where they're coming from and how they're getting there. And that's where the Contras come in. I mean, there's no doubt now, the CIA report is out, the Justice Department report is out. There's absolutely no doubt now that these men were Contras that were doing this drug trafficking. They were funding the offices, as I said. They've admitted it, although sometimes when the Justice Department gets a confession from people it doesn't like, it deems them unreliable, but these men admitted that they were Contras. And that's the other part of this book, and that's the other part of this historical track I'm talking about, is that it was okay for the Contras to deal drugs because they were doing it to fight communism. And as you know, and a lot of you lived through that era, that was the be-all and the end-all of our existence in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, was to fight communism. Nothing else was as important. And so what happened was, when these traffickers came under suspicion, the police that were investigating would be told, look elsewhere. Investigations would be compromised. Informants would disappear. People would be let out of jail. And none of these cases seemed to go anywhere. And the Inspector General of the Justice Department admitted in his recent report that, yeah, these men were under investigation for 10 years and none of them were successful. But it doesn't mean anybody was interfering with it. It just means that we have the most incompetent drug police in the entire world because everybody knew what these guys were doing. So it seems to me that if you're looking for the root of a drug problem in a neighborhood, nothing else really matters except the drugs and where they're coming from and how they're getting there. And that's where the Contras come in. I mean, there's no doubt now, the CIA report is out, the Justice Department report is out. There's absolutely no doubt now that these men were Contras that were doing this drug trafficking. They were funding the offices, as I said. They've admitted it, although sometimes when the Justice Department gets a confession from people it doesn't like, it deems them unreliable. But these men admitted that they were Contras. And that's the other part of this book, and that's the other part of this historical track I'm talking about, is that it was okay for the Contras to deal drugs because they were doing it to fight communism. And as you know, and a lot of you lived through that era, that was the be-all and the end-all of our existence in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, was to fight communism. Nothing else was as important. And so what happened was, when these traffickers came under suspicion, the police that were investigating would be told, look elsewhere. Investigations would be compromised. Informants would disappear. People would be let out of jail. And none of these cases seemed to go anywhere. And the Inspector General of the Justice Department admitted in his recent report that, yeah, these men were under investigation for 10 years and none of them were successful. But it doesn't mean anybody was interfering with it. It just means that we have the most incompetent drug police in the entire world because everybody knew what these guys were doing. And as you'll see if you read the book, I've got DEA cables, I've got CIA cables, I've got FBI cables. Everybody knew what they were doing. And in 1986, the LA County Sheriff's Office, the only agency to actually do anything about these guys, they filed an affidavit down in court seeking a search warrant for this Contra drug ring. And in it, they laid out the entire situation. They were dealing drugs, they were bringing it into South Central, they were selling it to primarily black drug dealers, and they were taking the money to Florida and laundering it and using it to buy drugs. This was a sworn affidavit from an LA County Sheriff's Office in October 1986. They went out on that raid, and the places, 14 places, they were all clean. They were all clean. People were telling them they were waiting for them. I mean, these how blatant these guys were. They said, oh, we thought you'd be here an hour ago. This was supposed to be a top secret drug raid. So that was the only attempt. After that, nothing happened. And until 1992, none of these men was prosecuted. Now it's interesting that after the Contra War was over and they weren't needed anymore, suddenly they became expendable and a lot of them started getting arrested. Norman Meneses, who was the head of this thing, got busted down in Nicaragua in '91 by the Nicaraguan police. He lived here in the Bay Area for years and years and years, never been arrested. Within 18 months, the Sandinista police arrested him and charged him with drug trafficking and convicted him and sentenced him to 30 years in jail. And when I was down there looking through the records of the Nicaragua Supreme Court, trying to figure out how come they could do it with one policeman and a couple of detectives when the entire United States government with its spy satellites and its CIA and DEA and a million of other intelligence organizations couldn't bring this man to justice for 20 years. The judges down there were wondering the same thing, and they didn't believe him. They didn't believe this cop when he came and said, this man's a major cocaine trafficker. And the judge says, well, how can you say that? He's been living in the United States all these years. If he's such a big drug dealer, why didn't the United States arrest him? And his response was a typical bureaucratic fashion, I suggest you ask the United States that question. Well, now we know the answer to that question. It was being protected. Now, lately, there had been two reports that came out, one by Justice and one by the CIA. Both of them announced that they saw nothing wrong, that this was all just explained by happenstance and coincidence, and nobody did anything wrong. And when you read the report, you find out that the person that wrote the conclusions obviously didn't read the report because they're wildly at variance. I found that, just to give you one example, Justice Department report talked about a cable from the San Francisco FBI office in 1988, written by an FBI agent to FBI headquarters. I mean, this wasn't something he was writing to himself. He sent this to FBI headquarters. And he said, the FBI believes that Norman Meneses, the head of this drug ring, was and may still be a DEA informant, which was true. Another reason he got away with what he did for so long, because he was working for the DEA. He also said, San Francisco FBI believes that Norman Meneses was and may still be an informant for the CIA. This is in an FBI file. The Justice Department's Inspector General said that didn't mean a thing. You can't read anything into that. Now, but it gets even worse. During the course of the investigations the CIA was doing, they suddenly discovered that, to their surprise, there was an agreement between the Justice Department and the CIA not to report drug trafficking by CIA agents or assets. And I say to their surprise because this agreement had been in effect from 1982 until 1995. So now when you hear the CIA, as we did during the 80s, say there's no evidence of contra-drug trafficking, now we know why there's no evidence. Nobody was given them anything, nor were they required to. And the Inspector General of Justice went and looked at the level of cooperation between the CIA and the DEA and reported that he could find very little evidence that the CIA had ever told the DEA anything about any drug traffickers, not just Contras, the drug traffickers in general. So we've got a situation where there was a deal made for 13 years. The Justice Department didn't have to be told about CIA drug trafficking. And I thought, well, maybe they forgot to put it on the list. Maybe I'm a hopeful guy. Maybe the Just Say No administration just forgot to put drug trafficking on this list of crimes. And then Congresswoman Maxine Waters faxed me a couple of letters she got from the CIA. And one of them was a letter from William French Smith, the former director of the Department of Justice under Reagan, to William Casey, the former head of the CIA under Reagan, and saying, oh, by the way, Bill, somebody pointed out that we forgot to put drug trafficking on the list. And he said, but I don't think it's necessary because, there's been such great cooperation between DEA and the CIA that we don't have to worry about it. And Bill Casey wrote back and said, gee, thanks, Bill. This strikes a proper balance between legitimate law enforcement needs and protection of sources and methods. So that's it. I mean, and that's where things stand today. We've got all this evidence out there that we were essentially sold a bill of goods during the entire Reagan era, that we had allowed our freedom fighters to pollute our cities with drugs and guns. That's another part of the book that I didn't get into in the newspaper series, was this wasn't just a drug ring, it was an arms ring. And they were supplying automatic weapons. They were an all-service drug ring, and they would do anything. And so that's where we are, and I don't get any great sense that anybody other than Maxine Waters and maybe John Conyers are all that interested in starting to pry up these rocks and look underneath them and see why there's all these files in the DEA and the FBI talking about contra drug dealing and CIA drug dealing that officially never happened. Nobody in Washington is all that interested in it. So, that's sort of a pessimistic report, I'm afraid, but this is an issue that historically Congress has not wanted to tackle. That's really where things stand. But on the other hand, we have a lot of people here tonight that are obviously interested in this topic. And I work in government now, and I can tell you that when lawmakers start hearing from people saying, we want you to investigate this, they start getting antsy. That's the reason the story got cranked down in the first place, is that people started marching in the streets and people started going to congressional hearings in Washington. And I'll tell you one thing, those Senate Intelligence Committee hearings in November '96 were the scariest things Congress has ever seen. I mean, you had rooms full of people, jam-packed in congressional hearing rooms, shouting senators down from the floor. And if you've ever seen government at work, you've got a bunch of lobbyists out there sort of genuflecting to these guys all day. That wasn't the situation. People were mad about it, people were demanding answers about it, and the way they avoided the question was to quash the story, write a bunch of stories in the mainstream press about how there's nothing here, go away, and we'll investigate it and take our word for it. So now the suspects have investigated themselves and cleared themselves. But I still think we need a real investigator. So I'll be happy to take questions. Porter Goss. This will be a fun one to write. Porter Goss is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He's a longtime CIA covert operative. He brags about it. It's on his resume. He's the head of the House Intelligence Committee. Why don't you write Porter a letter and ask him to investigate contract drug dealing? It'll just infuriate him. I mean, nothing will happen, but you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you've made this man mad. So that's what I would suggest.
Could you talk about, the role of the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and how they jumped on immediately? And if you could, if you think you have some information related to the more recent story about the time of CNN story.
Oh, yeah, the tailwinds, right? It's another great example, yeah. In case you didn't hear, the question was, what did I think about the Washington Post, New York Times? Maybe I can explain why. I don't know for sure. I can tell you what I believe happened. These newspapers, all through the 1980s, whenever this issue arose, whether it was the Senate report by John Kerry's committee in '89 that said the Contras deal in drugs, and the CIA probably knows about it. This was a 3-year investigation that was completely whitewashed by the media. I mean, they just buried this story deep as you can get. When the Kerry committee was holding congressional hearings, the papers were saying there's nothing here, there's nothing here. LA Times wrote a great piece. DEA says there's no supporting evidence. That was the headline of the story. DEA says there's no supporting evidence, but Senate wants to look anyway. And they wrote a story about how this is all nonsense and it's just a bunch of drug traffickers. And the DEA assures us that this wasn't going on. And as we know now, thanks to the Inspector General's report, the DEA not only knew what was going on, it was employing the man that was doing it. That's the role that the media played in assuring us all that this was just, probably Sandinista propaganda that we shouldn't take seriously because these, after all, are the freedom fighters. So when the story came back up in '96, and they not only had another newspaper reporting that it happened, but had court documents and sworn testimony from the men who were doing it saying, au contraire, we actually were doing this. They didn't know how to react, and so their initial reaction was to do what they did in the late '80s, which was just ignore it, right? It'll go away. We won't write about it. And for about a month and a half, nobody wrote about it. The problem this time was this thing called the internet, and the fact that the Mercury News had put this story and put all our supporting documentation and put animated maps and sound clips and everything else up on the internet, sort of did a detour around the media roadblock and allowed people to find out about the story. And the other interactive part here was talk radio, because that's who started calling when the story went out, was talk radio. And so I was able to go on the radio and say, look, don't believe me, go to our website, here's the address, look at the stuff for yourself, and if you don't want to believe it, fine, but I think there's a lot of stuff up there you should see. And a lot of people took that advice. As I pointed out, one day we had like 1.3 million hits on the web page, which was phenomenal. I mean, the newspaper's got a circulation of about 253,000, and we were getting email from all over the world. I mean, people literally all over the world were reading this stuff and printing it out and spreading it around. So then the major media said, well, now we're 3 weeks, a month behind the story. What do we do now? And the solution was, well, let's see where he was wrong. It wasn't to go out and say, let's find out, let's find some witnesses who can corroborate this. They did stories quoting honest. I mean, this is the thing that was most surprising to me: unnamed sources, unnamed government sources. saying, oh no, there's nothing to this. I mean, when do we quote unnamed bank robbers saying, oh no, I didn't do anything to that, I didn't do it, the cops are just, just the cops. You would never see a story in the paper if we had to sort of use that as a standard of evidence. And that leads me into the Tailwind story, when this is the CNN thing that was just retracted and apologized for, about this covert operation in Vietnam, I think it was 70, 71, where they allegedly used nerve gas on American defectors. And I saw the report. I read Floyd Abrams's apologia for it, and I thought, this story sounds right to me. I mean, based on the standards of evidence you use in journalism, which they used. You use named sources, they had people on the record saying it. You use government documents, they had government documents strongly suggesting this happened. And suddenly, that's not good enough anymore. Suddenly we need this thing called proof. Now, I don't know, I've never found proof in my life. I mean, I've been a reporter, I find information. I find things that suggest a number of things. Sometimes I even get confessions. I mean, I had a murder suspect confess to me one time. But that's still not proof. CNN said we didn't have sufficient proof to run the story. And I think Jerry Sepos used the exact same words in his apology for my series, saying we didn't have sufficient proof that top CIA officials knew about it. We got it now, of course, because the CIA has admitted it, but we didn't have it then. So what you're seeing is it's called raising the bar. And when you're in the newspaper business, you go into your editor with a story that's kind of hot. You generally figure out where the guy is coming from by his reaction to the story. Usually editors that like this stuff say, yeah, this is great, let's stick it in the paper, let's get it in the paper as fast as we can. The nervous Nellies would say, did he confess? Do we have an affidavit? Can you get him to sign an affidavit admitting it? And at that point, you begin to sense that the guy really doesn't want the story to go in the paper, because nobody's ever going to confess to a reporter, but that's what they're demanding now. So you will not see stories about the CIA anymore, because you'll never get proof what those guys are up to. That's their raison d'etre. That's the reason they exist. They do everything so they can deny it. And they're not bad at what they do. I mean, they don't leave paper trails around by and large. So what I saw in my case and what I saw in the case of the Tailwind story was the same situation. You don't have proof, we can't say it unless we have a confession. Therefore, forget any more stories about covert CIA operations. And the other lesson we're learning from the Chiquita experience in Cincinnati, where they have actually got a reporter under criminal investigation, and listen to this crime he committed. He got email messages of corporate executives plotting bribery schemes in Honduras. Put them in the newspaper. He's the one that's under criminal investigation, not the corporate executives. Now figure out who's calling the shots here. I think we're out of control. We've got no control left in the newspaper business whatsoever. If reporters can go out and do stories that have, and in this case, a confession, I think you could easily take that into a court of law and put that man on the witness stand and ask him if this isn't his voice on the tape. Now even courtroom standards aren't good enough. So what you're seeing is, I think, a retrenching all the way in investigative reporting. You're not, unless it deals with Monica Lewinsky, and then the sky's the limit. You can write anything you want about that. In the back.
Was an airport for drugs coming from Central America at the time Clinton was
Right.
governor, or maybe he was still attorney general. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I wrote a part of a chapter on MENA. Because what was going on there was very similar to what was going on with the drug ring here in California. We interviewed a fellow who was an arms manufacturer, and he's got a webpage. You ought to see this stuff this guy makes. It's unbelievable. It's called La France Specialties. I think you can look it up on your web browser. It's called La France Specialties, and he makes all sorts of high-tech gizmos for cops and SWAT teams and all sorts of things. And he was hired by these drug traffickers to go down to El Salvador and set up a plant down in a bus station down there to make pistols for the Contras. And it's very similar to a book called Compromised, written by a fellow named Terry Reed, who's sort of a hero to the right. Reed was a former Air Force intelligence operative who ended up working for the CIA in Arkansas, putting together machine shops so they could make untraceable weapons parts for the Contras. And he set one up in Mexico for the agency and discovered that there was cocaine that was being shipped in these huge boxes back to the United States. And Reed was working very closely with Barry Seal, who was a drug trafficker in Louisiana, a major drug trafficker in Louisiana. And Seal was part of this operation, according to Reed. So there's a lot of smoke at MENA. It's another situation where I don't think there's been a real investigation. The only investigations were done by the CIA, and they said, now picture this. You got to figure, MENA, Arkansas is this little bunghole of a town up in the mountains in Arkansas. The CIA Inspector General says, well, it's true. We were doing joint training exercises up there. And it's true that we had a facility there that was repairing CIA aircraft, but we didn't know what was going on. Now, of all places in the world, can't the CIA get its planes fixed anywhere but Mena, Arkansas? Think about it. But this is another one that has never been investigated, and I don't sense that there's a lot of willingness to do so. When I was talking to Jesse Jackson about this when I was up in Chicago. And I said, why isn't Clinton jumping all over this Contra drugstore? And he said, well, he's got the little problem down in Mena, Arkansas to contend with. And he's afraid that if they go in and start digging this stuff up, they're going to start digging up Mena, and then everybody's going to come out looking bad. And heavens knows you don't want to do that in politics. So I think there's stuff worth looking at Mena. Yeah.
Money, but there was an element of mind control and mass mind control involved.
No, the short answer is no. What I did find evidence of was that the Contras, the people that were dealing the drugs, did go into black neighborhoods consciously. And actually one of them was on tape talking to one of his associates about why he came up to San Francisco and tried to encourage him to get into the black thing, is what he called it. And his friend said, well, why is that? He said, well, because when they start killing themselves, nobody cares. So, and he was also caught on tapes and other conversations saying, it's great to deal in black neighborhoods because it goes so fast, you don't have to warehouse it. It just, as soon as you sell it to them, it's gone and they're back for more. So he was very conscious. This was Blandone. He was very conscious of why he was down there selling it, and was encouraging other drug traffickers to take cocaine into black neighborhoods. I think that's his MBA talking, more than any conspiracy. He just knew there was not going to be a police problem, and he was right. The drug ring operated down there untouched by the cops for years and years and years. So.
Drugs is much bigger than the Contras or the LA. It's very global. I think the whole global economy would collapse if the drug trade was.
Yeah, the question was, and the observation was that it seems like this drug situation with the government is bigger than what I even wrote about, and that the problem with the sarin story is it exposed sort of U.S. hypocrisy vis-a-vis our complaints that Iraq was using it. And I think that's a good observation. I think in both of these cases, in the case of my story and in the case of the Tailwind story, you had newspapers or news organizations alleging crimes of state. That's at the bottom. That's what this is. This is a crime of state. Government involvement, drug trafficking, locking up its own citizens for doing the same thing the government does. If we're using nerve gas on our own people in Vietnam, how can we tell other people not to? They're very dangerous stories. They are very dangerous stories because they undermine our faith in our government, which frankly should be undermined if this is going on. But that's the reaction of the media, is not to undermine our faith in the government, it's to reassure us that everything's fine, you know, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, everything's okay. There are no crimes of state. Oceania has always been our enemy. We've always been at war. I mean, that's literally, that's what it is. And when you get out of step with that, then the acts fall.